It's great to see you again, Blake. It's great to have you on the show. And I'm very, very interested in what you were telling me about your podcast that you're starting called Ambidology. Is that correct? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
That is correct. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Steve. It's great to see you as well.
Oh, sure. And so now, is this a real word or is this a word you made up? And if so, I'd love to know exactly what it means.
Yeah, this is a 100% made up word.
I love it.
To my knowledge, I have not found anyone else who has, as of yet, coined this phrase. Of course, I could be wrong. I should probably copyright it.
You should.
Yeah. Ambiology, on the simplest level, is a combination of the words ambidextrous and ideology.
Okay. And why did you bring those two concepts together?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of an origin story, I suppose, on the word. I had at some point, I'm a fan of martial arts. I train jiu-jitsu and some other martial arts. And at some point I was watching an interview with a young fighter and his coach. And they were talking about striking technique. And the coach was discussing the fact that, traditionally, like let's say in boxing or in a traditional martial art, everybody trained either orthodox or southpaw, right? You were either left-handed or right-handed. And he was saying that the more modern approach is that you learn both left-handed and right-handed. And the younger fighter said something that I thought was quite interesting, which was that his goal was really not to be competent left-handed and right-handed, but to become unhanded and to not have a defined stance at all. And at some point when I was musing about my own ideological journey into sort of tribal homelessness, I guess I would say, it occurred to me that was an intriguing concept, to imagine what it would be like to have an ideology that was unhanded, that was not automatically defined by the domain of the left-right spectrum.
Welcome to Rhythm of Life. I'm Steve Ordower. Today on the show, we welcome Blake Minnerly, who is launching his own podcast show called Ambidology that examines the political left-right spectrum in the United States from a historical perspective. Much of what we think is left or right politically actually has shifted over time, and this paradigm has become a significant stumbling block for citizens to view issues on a case-by-case basis that would allow for a substantive understanding of a given issue in a nuanced way. Instead, and consequently, this left-right divide incentivizes people to lump issues together into a tribal identity, which creates a psychological barrier to useful and empowering insight on important matters. This ubiquitous and insidious paradigm conditions us in the U.S. to view political issues through a powerful filter, which oftentimes has us discount perspectives from the quote-unquote bad tribe without fully understanding the perspective in the first place. This show will investigate the beginnings of public relations and propaganda with people such as Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who has been criticized for manipulating public opinion, often in ways that have undermined individual autonomy and democratic values. His best-known campaigns include a 1929 effort to promote female smoking by branding cigarettes as feminist, quote-unquote, torches of freedom, and his work with the United Fruit Company in the 1950s connected with the CIA-orchestrated overthrow of the democratically elected Guatemalan government in 1954. And Ivy Leadbelly Lee, who preceded Bernays, who many historians credit him with originating modern crisis communications. He was retained by the Rockefellers in 1914, initially to represent Standard Oil after the bloody repression of the coal mining strike in Colorado known as the Ludlow Massacre. Both Bernays and Lee were masters at shaping perspective on behalf of corporations and governments, appealing directly to the subconscious mind, often undetectable to the general public. Ambidology will reflect upon the writings and scholarship of people such as Noam Chomsky, who co-authored the book The Manufacturing of Consent, Marshall McLuhan, who is known as the father of media studies, and most recently, Hiram and Verlin Lewis, who wrote the book The Myth of Left and Right, How the Political Spectrum Misleads and Harms America.
I think that I would want to sort of clarify immediately, because I think that this approach is rife with possibility for misunderstanding.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah, right.
Because everybody wants to be in their camp, for sure.
Well, it's the water that we all swim in, right? And so even just conceptually, axiomatically from the get-go, I'm asking people to sort of crawl out of the ocean, and you're going to flop around like a fish out of water, right? Because it's the entire sort of axiomatic structure of the way that we discuss politics is based on the assumption that the left-right spectrum is simply kind of axiomatic reality. And so some things that it's not, that approach, it's not an argument for centrism. It's not an argument for both sidesism. It's not an argument that there's perfectly good people on both sides. It's an argument for the idea that the left-right spectrum is not an inherent reality, but is a mythology that we tell ourselves, or perhaps more neutrally, it is a narrative and a lens through which we try and understand our political selves, and that we can let go of it entirely and see what the world looks like when we no longer make the assumption that we must have all political and ideological discourse within that limitation.
What's so bad about that? I mean, just to play devil's advocate, what's so bad about, being in your tribe and seeing things from a certain perspective that might actually empower people, at least people are led to believe, and, I would think, so-and-so leans left or so-and-so leans right, and they're from a family that does so. And they grow with their family in that regard, and say, they have, say, progressive values in which they care about other people, or they have conservative values, which, self-reliance. That doesn't sound so bad on the surface, does it?
Yeah, I suppose not. And I think that there's a couple ways that and incidentally, I'm not even sure that the approach is based on the idea that it's good or bad. Although I suppose I do think there are things about it that are bad. But we could start with a more neutral way of approaching the issue that doesn't necessarily rely on any kind of moral judgment, which is just that if we do assume that the left-right spectrum is a form of lens through which we look at the world, then the acquisition of truth value is always going to be aided by trying to dismantle whatever lenses we bring to the conversation. And if we're having that conversation within a box, then it sort of stands to reason that we want to get out of that box in order to optimize our possibility of understanding new aspects of the world.
Because it sounds like there's metaphorical blinders on, is what you're kind of describing, and we don't even realize they're there. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a part of it, because most of us have not even really considered the idea that we might look at politics in general, and in particular, sort of the story of American representative democracy. I want to use magic quotes there, but the story of American empire, perhaps more accurately, is deeply affected by the fact that we always view it through that lens. And I think there is something that I would sort of judge as bad in that that lens is not neutral, it also asks us to conceive of the world as one in which there are two teams, essentially, that are in continuous ideological battle against each other, and that the only real choice that we have in terms of how we approach ideological discussion is which is the good team and which is the bad team. And once we've chosen that, obviously the other team is the bad team, and it becomes our duty to combat that bad team and try and achieve ascendancy for our good team. And historically, I don't really think I can think of a single example in which that approach has led to high truth value.
Ah, interesting. Well, there was an interview that you hit me to recently with the brothers on the podcast Conversations with Coleman that just blew me away. And I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I remember, the premise is that basically, it speaks directly to what you're talking about, the mythology of the two-party system and this tribalism that really kind of puts these metaphorical blinders on us. And so what their research was showing, I think it was Hiram and Verlin. Was it
Hiram and Vernon Lewis?
Lewis, yes. And they did some great scholarship. And basically they were saying, people will cling to one or two issues, and the next thing with that a political party espouses or what have you, and then they just get in line with the rest, and that gets in the way of people thinking critically about issue by issue by issue. And I've noticed this particularly in this country, and amplified over the pandemic, is that it inhibits real conversation. And I noticed this in a real big way because there's so much emotion involved in it, and it kind of turns off the logic part of the brain, and it's very disturbing to witness. And so, when you and I reconnected after years of not seeing each other since college, and we started talking about this, it was like, oh my gosh, because I felt so alone. I'm thinking, is anybody else seeing this?
Yeah.
Is anybody else seeing this? And you're saying, yes, brother, I see. I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it. I'm hearing you loud and clear. And that's why I think, it's so important to have nuanced conversation. But the thing is, what you're trying to do, at least from what you've said in terms of the goal of your podcast, which was so intriguing to me on so many levels, which is you're first dealing with people's mindset from a historical perspective so that they can, this is an attempt so that they can hear what you have to say. And what you have to say is not, oh, choose this or choose that stance on a political issue or be with this tribe or that tribe. It has nothing to do with that. It's more like just recognizing that you don't need to fall into these camps at all. You just, what you're trying to get to is a clean slate, to be unhanded, as you mentioned before with the martial arts metaphor, which is really, really, I think, beautiful, which is like, let's not have a predisposed way of thinking about each issue. Oh, I'm this, I'm that. I'm like, there's some conservative, there's some conservative philosophies that are wonderful. There's some progressive philosophies that are wonderful. They're not mutually exclusive. We can have, I think everybody should be more of an independent thinker. And I think that that's what you're promoting with your idea for this show.
Yeah, that's certainly a big part of it. And I'd maybe even take it one step further and say that the idea of the left-right spectrum and that we have to operate within that spectrum in order to have any kind of ideological discussion at all prevents us from making a real systemic institutional analysis of how our system works, of how we have come to this moment in time. And I think it just creates a lot of low resolution, high, as you were kind of referring to, high emotion, low rationality discussion.
Yeah, totally. And it gets people all ginned up and, like, oh my God, you can't say this, you can't say that. And you say one wrong thing and then somebody's cutting you off and saying, and lumping you in with all this other stuff, that they have no idea about. And the more you explained your goal here, the more I was thinking, man, this is exactly what's needed right now more than ever.
Well, I mean, for me personally, I found that, I'll back up a little bit and say that I don't want to speak for you, but I think I can confidently say that both of us maybe began this process of exploration by sort of due diligence. We both came from a very traditional sort of leftist background. We grew up in the South Side of Chicago, and I went to school, and you grew up in the neighborhood of Hyde Park. That is sort of a bastion of progressive democratic thought. The University of Chicago and all of that, the center of, broadly speaking, like Michelle and Barack Obama and Harold Washington and Rahm Emanuel and all of these individuals really at the center of modern progressive policy really came from that neighborhood. And I grew up in a staunchly democratic household that espoused very strong progressive beliefs, the vast majority of which I still adhere to, and I know that you do as well. And I think probably about 10 years ago, there was a puzzling realignment that began to occur in which values that I think we had traditionally associated with the left, values like free speech, civil liberties, anti-censorship, anti-war, that these values suddenly seemed to be shifting. And not only were they shifting, but there was a kind of an instantaneous retelling of history in which they were never really a part of the package to begin with. And institutions that had been viewed with great suspicion, intelligence agencies, certain corporate institutions, certain government institutions, were suddenly sort of brought to the forefront of what should be the institutions that we trust the most, that we align ourselves with the most. And it seemed like a lot of people were not really struggling with this sort of new memo that showed up about what we were now supposed to believe. And I think both of us and a lot of other people did struggle with it because we firmly held to those ideas. And so we suddenly found ourselves at odds with our sort of historic tribe. And some people have responded to that by sort of going to the other side. Some have been essentially pushed to the other side, because if you reject your own tribe, the first thing that's going to happen, as pretty much always happens in tribal politics since the dawn of man, is that you're going to get excoriated and pushed out and accused of being the other. And so that certainly happened as well, where all of a sudden, it's like the defense of free speech or objecting to censorship is something that can get you called far right, right? It's very confusing. And, it left, I think, from our conversations that we've already had, left us both feeling very confused and mystified.
Yes.
And I just found that once I let go of my conviction that there was such a thing as a stable left philosophy and right philosophy that were consistent over time, and instead realized that they were essentially a story that we tell ourselves about two factions of American empire, everything started to make a lot more sense.
Yo, totally, man, dude. I keep wanting to say preach, like I'm in church and I'm a Jewish man, but doesn't make any sense. But that's the thing. I mean, it's like, and then when you and I started talking about, it's not just the stories we tell ourselves; it's the stories that we've been told in a very proactive and purposeful way. And then you started hipping me to Edward Bernays, and who's the I think he's the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And then what was that? Leadbelly Lee? What was that gentleman's name?
Leadbelly Lee.
Leadbelly Lee, who was like the precursor to Edward Bernays. And these guys basically laid the groundwork for the public relations, which is really about shaping perspective in a very, very powerful way, dealing directly to the subconscious mind in a very insidious way. I mean, it's happening to us all, and we don't even realize. And you just like, oh, well, I'm part of this tribe, and I'm part of that tribe, and there's not a whole lot of conscious thought going on. But then all of a sudden, it's like you and I just kind of started to wake up to it, and now we're trying to process it. And I think first of all, we got to distinguish what the hell is happening, which is one of the aims of your show, which I'm so psyched for. And I can't wait for this to start rolling out. And this whole idea of this interview here is so that people get introduced to the concept of your show, so that they can start realizing this proactive effort to shape us into these tribes. Because when we're not really having these nuanced conversations, the powers that be maintain power, and they can continue to do what they want to at our expense, unfortunately. So it's really it's really quite amazing to go down this road and to kind of so to speak look at things from an unattached lens, not trying to fit things into these categories. It's like, oh, I can listen to politicians now more from any political persuasion and just listen to them. Like, listen to them. My litmus test, and I think I shared this with you a while ago, which is no matter how controversial the person is, I don't care who it is. Have I listened to them directly from their mouth in context? And have I consistently listened to them to form my own opinion? Or am I listening through what other people are telling me about them and how to listen? And I see a whole lot of the second part of what I was saying more than the first part with people I'm talking to. And you mentioned, hot button issues or certain politicians or certain public figures, and people like reacting. And it's almost like this automatic reaction that they don't even realize they're having. And so in order to do this, you've got to be disciplined in yourself and also carry a certain level of humility. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that since this is mostly a process of sort of removing top layers that were limiting perception, the last thing we want to do is immediately replace that with some new lens that sort of diminishes our epistemic humility. The point of doing this is to explore, and to explore as an individual, as someone who can look at history with an open mind and re-envision sort of the story of who we are and how we got here as an ongoing exploration. And so certainly I am very early in this process. I am focusing much more on questions than answers. I feel that I have learned a lot by removing that lens and then re-examining history that really already been familiar with, but it was like I was seeing it for the first time.
Yes.
Once I took those glasses off.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm very cautious about ascribing a definitive narrative. That was the problem in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But I do, I want to circle back for a second to Vernon and Hiram Lewis and their book, The Myth of Left and Right.
Oh, man.
I really can't give them enough credit because they certainly were their work was the first work that really opened my eyes to the idea that the fundamental axiom of the left-right axis is utterly illogical. It's absurd on its face, but we all believe it. And and what I mean by that is that and I'm summarizing a lot of their arguments here.
Sure.
The idea of the left-right spectrum is essentially based on the axiomatic belief that there is one philosophical essence that divides all issues into two bins. And that philosophical essence, that sort of stripped down principle, can be used to, put abortion and, tax cuts over here and Ukraine and whatever else over there. And that every new issue that comes up can be automatically sorted in that way. Well, that's absurd. There's not one political issue. Totally. There's thousands. There's not one ideological value or perspective. There's an infinite number of them.
Totally.
So and when people try usually to identify, what is it that really differentiates, let's say, the left from the right, or, progressives from conservatives. We tell ourselves all kinds of stories about that. Conservatives are, pro-tradition or anti alternative lifestyles, like let's say LGBT, and then you learn that like FDR, who I think most people would identify as kind of the godfather of modern progressivism, was very active in prosecuting homosexuals.
Oh, that blew me away. I was like, you got to be kidding, really? Yeah, it's exactly. Then I was just like, okay, it's a whole new ball game when I heard that. But anyway, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that's a historical issue, of course. I mean, there really was no conceptualization of being an advocate for homosexuality in 1935. Well, that's not entirely true, but at least not in a broadly populist way.
Yeah, it was cloaked heavy, I'm sure, back then. Yeah. You're like, whoa.
It wasn't even just an issue. Like, it wasn't something that differentiated sort of the political teams.
Right. Right.
That's the other thing, of course, to realize is that the idea that there is a left and a right and that everybody is sort of has to make a choice between one or the other is not something that sort of appeared with, the founding fathers. I hate that term, but we'll use it since we all know what we're talking about.
Sure.
It's something that really has only existed, for the last 100 years. And even then, more like the last 60 or 70. It's kind of a post-World War II phenomenon and barely was in the popular lexicon at all before the Russian Revolution. I mean, the terms originated from the French Revolution and were literally the left and right side of an aisle, of the royalists, the people who thought that the monarch should have some sort of legislative veto, and the people who didn't. So it was used in that context, but it wasn't used in an American context for the first 150 years or so of our history.
Interesting.
No one would have known what you were talking about in 1880 if you were like, are you on the left or the right? There was certainly the Democrats and the Republicans. But even then, I think it was much more common to support the Democrats on this issue and the Republicans on that issue, and not necessarily feel that you have to make a choice. Right?
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting because, some people might hear this and say, well, you're just hiding from really taking a definitive stance on things. And that's not it at all. It's more, you're saying, let's separate, take issue by issue as opposed to lump them all together. And, there's all this pressure, this social pressure to take a very specific stance on very specific things, particularly hot button issues. And of course, during the pandemic, that just was like exponentially amplified to a degree that I haven't seen it in my lifetime before. And it was really, really intense. But yeah, it really speaks to just how when you start really unraveling this stuff, it becomes painfully obvious just how ridiculous it is. Although there's nothing wrong with it's a beautiful thing to have values. It's a beautiful thing.
Essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is very specifically not saying that at all. I think it's very important to treat people decently. I think it's very important to move through the world in a way that you have some semblance, some modicum of integrity and being decent toward other and being a positive contribution to society. But that differs from person to person, and that's okay.
Absolutely. I think the part of the reason that I wanted to sort of coin the phrase ambiology is that I don't want to let go of ideology in the sense that I have ideals. I have things that even if I think we're never going to achieve, I still want to struggle for. I still want to try and emulate. I want to try and have universal compassion for all humans. I want to try and treat all people equally. I want to try and give all people dignity and respect. I want to avoid violence to the maximum degree possible. I think that these are actually basic values that almost all of us share, and where we get caught up is in what particular policies or actions or political or cultural or economic institutions are going to realize that ideology. So it's what I wanted with, that's why this is not moral relativism. It's not both sidesism. It's not saying like, well, you have a point and you have a point. It's simply saying that whatever values and ideals you have, which I think on some level are going to be part of some sort of spiritual process, even if we don't necessarily identify it with any kind of language that is remotely religious. In other words, we don't have to be discussing God. We certainly don't have to be discussing holy books. But we still are trying to ask ourselves, what matters to me beyond myself, right? Whether it's concern for my community, concern for my family, concern for the environment, the world, the universe. There's some way that we're trying to approach what it means to be alive in the world in a way that is caring, that is attempting to value something more than ourself and our individual needs. And so, that process is essential, I think, for humanity to survive, right? We're going to survive because of our ability to keep compassion for each other,
Yeah. Oh, totally.
And so it's not at all an argument for just being like, well, whatever values anybody has is fine. I have very strong opinions about a lot of these issues, but it's just more the idea that it's sort of what you mentioned when you start to see how specific what will get you identified as being on the left or on the right is. It starts to sort of reveal this is kind of absurd. How can it be that whether or not we are on the left or on the right is the result of our opinion about a specific medical product or a particular celebrity, right? Especially when that medical product or that celebrity or that whatever it is, it's not, I'm trying to be as non-specific as possible, actually, will change. 10 years ago, it was one way. Now the memo goes out and you can see everybody, not everybody, but you can see a lot of people instantly adjust to the message, get on the talking point, and use it to differentiate, the good tribe from the bad tribe. And we all get on board with, okay, now my tribe believes this, so Roseanne is terrible, or Roseanne is great, or RFK is terrible, or RFK is great. And I it's not even that I want to take specific positions on any of these. It's like, how can it be that some sort of stable philosophical principle that goes beyond the immediate demands of the moment is capable of instantly sorting what the expression of every celebrity and every product is in terms of its relevance to these kind of generalized ideological values? That makes no sense.
Oh, totally. And it's just it's so wonderful when you have to have a certain amount of, I don't know, groundedness that's actually at its foundation is a sense of humility and respect for others' opinions. Like, so for instance, I talked to I interviewed Dr. Boyce Watkins on this podcast a while ago, who was very, he was I think he'll love this, because he was very left-leaning Democratic, a very thoughtful, very astute black man who was all into the Democratic Party, and he finally kind of had an epiphany. It's like, wait a minute, they don't care about us. And it's not just that there's plenty of people in the Democratic Party that do care about these issues, for sure. It's not. I'm not making a generalization. I'm talking about a system here, which is what we're really talking about.
Absolutely.
And there's a system at play when you take a step back and look at it from a wider perspective. And he's like, whoa, wait a minute. I mean, why are there schools in Chicago where there's 54 schools that have been closed, but also there's been that many schools where black children aren't reading at grade level? But it's a democratically controlled by the Democrats, a city, and the school system is controlled by the Democrats. That's, supposedly for uplifting black people. That doesn't take away from other things that they might have done and have done that are good, but that's real. And that concerns him because he is all about helping the black community for real. And so he kind of took a step back from that, and he's like, well, I'm just for being black first. I'm for prioritizing black people. And when you're not locked in to this two-party system, this two-party divide, you start recognizing what's so, and what's so is, black children aren't being educated properly. And we need to do something about that. And so if you're locked into this tunnel vision, you just keep on doing the same thing and getting the same result. Well, that's kind of, I've heard that's, a definition of insanity, expecting a different result, but doing the same thing. And so when you kind of break free from that, then you can actually start making progress on things for real. And so he says, we should listen to all sides. And so what I talked to him about in this interview, which was really interesting, is, growing up as a Jewish person, just as an example, I was always told that Louis Farrakhan is anti-Semitic. And so, I don't know him personally, but I thought, you know what, let me go and see, let me go check him out to hear from him directly. So I went, and, we met in Madison, Wisconsin. And so I took our dear friend, David Marquardt, with me, who you remember. And
you know what? You also took Me.
You went to that?
Yeah, I was.
You came
there.
with me?
Yeah, I did.
Oh, wow. Oh, it was the three of us?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? Oh, my God.
The first and only time. I mean, I grew up probably, I don't know, a mile and a half or something from Farrakhan's mosque.
Wow. And that was intense.
But I had never seen the man in person and listened to him in person until that moment.
That's amazing. Wow, that's amazing. I had such tunnel vision because Dave Marquardt was from a very small town in Marshfield, Wisconsin. And, he was blown away and I was blown away. Now, I actually, not only did I not hear anything anti-Semitic, I learned a lot. Mm-hmm. Just because I had a certain stance and I was just trying to listen. And then I listened to 2 or 3 other full speeches of his on television. I still didn't hear anything. Now, do I still know? Can I say definitively one way or not if he's anti-Jewish? No, I don't know him. But as far as I know right now, I've never, ever heard anything directly from his mouth that I would say he's definitely anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish people or against Jewish people. And so when I was talking to Dr. Watkins about this, and he's vilified as well in this way, it's so refreshing to be able to just be grounded in who you are. And when I've said that to some of my Jewish friends, they immediately would say, oh, he's definitely blah, blah, blah. He's definitely anti-Semitic, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, okay, well, if there's something specific that you hear that he says, please let me know and I'll check it out myself or whatever. That should always be the litmus test. That should always be the scrutiny that we give everything, because there's so much in our society in the media landscape where people aren't hearing what other people are saying. They're hearing what other people are telling them to think about so-and-so, XYZ, whoever it is, whether it's Elizabeth Warren or Rand Paul or RFK Jr. There's a whole lot of, and I hear this from conservative folks or,
Absolutely.
and progressive folks, and they're not really interpreting what these people are saying accurately. I mean, I see it all the time. And my view is, just listen to the person directly. Make up your own mind. Yeah. That's all.
Yeah. And I think that starts to get at, we've sort of hinted at the idea that if the left-right spectrum is not, in fact, a default reality of political life, but is a narrative that we are told. And not only a narrative we are told, but a narrative we are told by the sorts of people that you alluded to earlier, who are part of an industry, a very old, very well-established industry of controlling narratives, which is a very valuable service for which they get paid a lot of money and have for a very long time.
Like Edward Bernays you're talking about?
Like Edward Bernays and Ivy Lee and the entire sort of crisis management PR industry, the communications industry, like what would have been called propaganda until propaganda got kind of a bad connotation after World War I, and had to be renamed as risk management or something like that in order to avoid that negative connotation, because people understood on a certain level that it meant manipulation of their emotions by people who have become skilled at learning certain kinds of psychological techniques. And because we know that industry exists, because we know that it's powerful, you have to conclude as a working hypothesis that the left-right spectrum is a means of social control. And that social control is, I think, elucidated exactly by the kinds of situations that you're talking about. If you can make it such that just listening to someone who is on the opposite team, let's say, who has been identified as part of the bad side, if that can automatically create a risk of expulsion from the tribe, if it can be constituted as a sort of form of dangerous disloyalty, then you create a powerful emotional mechanism of manipulation by that industry, right? The only thing that we have to do in order to vilify somebody who is maybe, let's say, making an argument that is affecting the bottom line of a powerful economic sector, whatever it is, oil, tobacco, pharma, ag, whatever, it doesn't matter, or an intelligence agency, or it could be anything. Anyone who has some degree of social power and the capital to go hire the firms that do this for a living, right?
And do it very well.
You're making the task much easier, right? Because all you have to do is paint them as far right, or far left, or whatever it is. You know, you want to demonize Bernie Sanders, call him a communist, you know. And problem solved, right? Well, he's bad. You know, even though a lot of the ideas that he is espousing are clearly sort of against the sort of elites that a lot of people who might identify as, say, MAGA now would resonate with, right? So we can take care of that problem, you know, like maybe people who are abandoning from a sort of libertarian conservative standpoint and going over to someone who's kind of a populist who's addressing class issues like Sanders. Let's just vilify him as a communist. Problem solved, right? Same thing with you know, on the opposite side, someone, you know, I don't know, let's take someone like Jordan Peterson.
Okay.
And this is, you know, again, to be clear, none of this has to do with anyone's actual opinion about the ideas being espoused by these people. It's not whether they are right or wrong about anything. It's not about whether they are good people or bad people. It's about the system of manipulation that we create just by axiomatically creating this axis, right? So Jordan Peterson, someone who ostensibly was at least clearly someone who, broadly speaking, was on the left, but starts to espouse ideas that are not compatible with the current needs of the faction of our political system that identifies itself as left. So just make him far right. Same, you know, RFK would be another example, you know. So we can come up with all of these. You know, I have heard, you know, you mentioned Ron Paul, you know, Elizabeth Warren,
and Rand Paul, right? And you know,
Rand Paul, excuse me. Yes. Rand Paul, and you know, this could be AOC. This could be, you know, pick your hero, pick your villain. It doesn't matter, you know, because we're trying to level up above the idea of, like, is this a good person or a bad person? Are they on the good team or the bad team? Let go of that for a second. And look at just what is the machinery that is being activated in order to try and get you to not listen to their ideas.
Totally. That's exactly at the heart of I think this conversation, which is it's like it's a great structure to have people just turn off and see things through this perspective, and it keeps us divided. You know, it's like everybody's a mixed bag. No one's like all good or all bad. We're all capable of killing somebody if we're put in the right situation. Absolutely. You want to defend your family? Absolutely. You know, so it really depends on the situation. And so it's like you can take, you know, the recent hearings with Bernie Sanders. Yeah, he's taken some pharma money, but is that making him all bad? No, hell no. Of course not. And same with, you know, I've seen a lot of commentators on the right are discounting Elizabeth Warren. But what I'm more attracted to is people who are saying, you know, I listened to a commentator talk about who is very, very concerned about the vaccines and big pharma and all that. And he talked about Elizabeth Warren in a very in a way that really speaks to what we're talking about. He said, Elizabeth Warren has done this, and this, and held banks accountable, and has really fought for consumer protection and this, that, and the other. But I just don't agree with her on this specific issue. And I was like, wow, that's such a breath of fresh air.
So rare.
Because it is rare. It is rare. And I got to say, I was really, really impressed. And we need more of that type of conversation. Like, the only person, one of the only few people that have really called for an audit of the Federal Reserve has been, I think, either Ron or Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders. Supposedly people on different sides of the aisle. But, most people don't realize how our government is structured and how the Federal Reserve fits into all that, and that the reason why that exists and why we really don't own our own money supply is because of a Banking Act of 1913. And it's like, well, let's not talk about that, and let's keep everybody separated. So, at the heart of this is that if we continue to look through life and very important issues through these lenses, we're not going to get to the heart of the issue. We're not going to be able to transform. And I see that having conversations like this and just making these distinctions to unravel this nonsense is like the most important part. It's the first step in allowing us to transform situations that are in real need of transformation.
Yeah, agreed, and allows us in a more unified way to start to look at a more accurate representation of our institutions and how they function, how they really function.
Totally.
Our institutions simply do not and have never functioned as two ideologically opposed camps that are in a constant struggle against each other that completely undersells the level of cooperation amongst elite loci of power, including individuals and institutions that would be firmly identified as being on the left or on the right, but are nonetheless really cooperating with each other much more than they're opposing each other, except rhetorically, right?
Yes.
And I think that this is part of the difficulty with with getting buy-in for trying this out as a suit of clothes, so to speak, because there's a very understandable reaction that maybe even some people are having right now listening to this, is that the first reaction, of course, that I think both of us have experienced is, you are betraying our team.
Totally, it's unsettling.
Regardless of which team you have chosen, taking this approach automatically is a betrayal of your team, because it's saying that your team is arbitrary. It's saying that your team is essentially based on a lie, right? So that's the first reaction, and understandable, very understandable.
Yes,
and another reaction that I think is very understandable is that it comes off, I think, very easily as a kind of impugning of the motivations of the individual. Like, you're saying that my objection to X, Y, or Z is, based on a lie. It's not real. And of course, it's important to realize that none of this has to do with the intentions of the individuals involved. It's my personal feeling that even though there are certainly people who want to bring about suffering and death and destruction of everything just because that's, for whatever reason, something they feel compelled to do, I am an optimist in the sense that I do still believe that the vast majority of people are operating in good faith. They're trying to make the world a better place. They're trying to help the people around them. They're trying to help the community around them. They're trying to help their family, their friends. They're trying to protect people that they perceive as vulnerable. They're trying to correct things that they see as unjust. And I certainly am not impugning any of that. I'm saying that we are constantly under the siege of some very powerful forms of manipulation that are not easy to deal with, not easy to see, not easy to combat.
Totally.
And are very effective and have been for a long time. And I think that's part of the history that you have to immediately start looking at. And it's why I think this process of saying, like, okay, maybe there is another way of looking at this besides left and right, is you have to immediately start to go look at the history of the evolution of the manipulation of the public mind.
Yep, totally. And that's where Edward Bernays and Ivy Leadbelly Lee. I love that his middle or nickname is Leadbelly. Like isn't that like a nickname of a blues guitarist?
Yeah, sure. Leadbelly. I grew up. My dad was a huge fan of folk music in general. We were always Leadbelly was always on the record player.
Oh,
Pete Seeger,
funny.
A good progressive '60s soundtrack. Was certainly the background to my upbringing.
Yeah, and with what you were just saying, I mean, I couldn't help but to think, like, when we're messing. This idea is messing with people's identity. Yeah. And identities are very well formed in a very subconscious way, and we don't even recognize it. And this is really unraveling that. So yeah, it might be unsettling, but I'm telling you, it is liberating as hell. Because that's how people grow. You got to be comfortable with the uncomfortableness. That's what growth is all about. And so, it's really easy to get wrapped up in religion or political persuasion or identify with the tribe or whatever it is. And so when, you mix politics and religion together, it's like, oh man, that's a powerful fusion. People are like, and they're ready to fight, and they're ready to, defend their team, so to speak. And when you're free of that, it's like, whoa. It's like you're taking these glasses off, and you recognize that much of it is contrived that you don't even realize. And then when that process starts happening, you can hear people in a different way. Yeah. Like I can hear people, who say I guess, who are, quote unquote, deem themselves more conservative, who are espousing the how important free speech is. And that used to be, espoused by people on the left. Who gives a crap? It's important. Free speech is important because free speech is important. It doesn't matter what category or what political party it is a part of, and by the wonderful research and scholarships and scholarship and writing by the who are the brothers again?
The Lewis brothers, Vernon and Hiram, The Myth of Left and Right.
Yeah, they are.
I wish I had the book somewhere. I got to dig it out. I would show it, but I really strongly recommend it. And it's interesting just because I think that, and then I'll add another thinker that had a profound impact on me, who was Noam Chomsky, many years ago, and who I read at the time voraciously. I read, in particular, had a big influence on me was The Manufacture of Consent. And he, I'm forgetting the co-author on that. He, oh goodness, I cannot remember the name of his co-author. And someone will, if we ever show this, will correct me on this. But interesting, because the Lewis brothers, I would say, broadly speaking, are coming from a relatively conservative, sort of libertarian tradition, right? And they kind of came to this conclusion. And I would say their values are still broadly libertarian. Right? Chomsky, obviously, much more from the sort of traditional kind of anarchical, socio-anarchical tradition, a follower of Bakunin, and sort of, based on this sort of principle of kind of far left free associations. And yet they both kind of come to the same basic conclusion, Chomsky was very illustrative for me in talking about people like Walter Lippmann and the Manufacture of Consent, which is the source of the title for that book, that the left and the right serve as a kind of a pair of bookends that limit the acceptable range of debate. It's like another really powerful function of left and right, is that if you frame things as, well, there's this side and that side, and they kind of fight and they sort of hate each other, then anything outside of that is, like, by definition, wacky, right? It's crazy because even the people on the left and the people on the right, well, they agree that that's nonsense, So it provides a very powerful tool for limiting the range of debate, and we can just it also makes the left-right spectrum a self-perpetuating idea, because once you adopt it, it does cause a great deal of personal discomfort to try and abandon it. Right?
It does.
It first of all, you become tribeless, and we all as humans have a desire to belong. We have a desire to get along, and from an evolutionary standpoint, to be ejected from the tribe was a death sentence. Right?
Yeah.
If you cannot get along with the people around you politically, in the larger sense of that word, that you're going to wind up dead, And so it's a very powerful reaction to think, like, well, if I come up with this idea, I'm not going to be a part of my team anymore. I also lose my sense of moral certainty. The adoption of the left and the right are an easy way to have a categorization of what is and what is not moral, right?
So,
I don't have to worry about shades of gray.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry about people, like, I don't have to worry about the idea that Farrakhan might not be exactly good or bad, but a mixture of the two. And most importantly, I don't have to worry about if I'm a mixture of good and bad. I'm on the good team.
Oh, absolutely. I'm all about being good, and they're bad, and I can justify who I am and my existence and my identity at the drop of a hat. No problem.
One of my favorite quotes that I was thinking of when you were talking about this idea is Solzhenitsyn's line, the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And those are words that I very much have come to live by, and to understand that the process of trying to identify the bad people is universally used historically by one group of control-oriented authoritarians to kill off or disempower another group of control-oriented authoritarians who are trying to step on their territory.
Dude, I mean, I've got to say, and I know I've said this to you more than once in our previous conversations before today, but, Malcolm X
Absolutely.
said, you gotta be careful of the media, because they'll have you loving the oppressor and hating the oppressed. And I mean, the Black Panthers were a perfect example. We did an episode
100%.
on Fred Hampton of the Black Panthers, a young, brilliant leader. And they were painted as terrorists, and they were reacting to terrorism, and the police were good. And there was this, and they straight up murdered them. And, through a program known as COINTELPRO, that was a government program with the FBI, and basically, enacted and the force that went through with the assassination was basically the Chicago police. And it was like, it was so just so stark and so revealing in terms of how people viewed the Black Panthers, and how powerful this type of perspective shaping really is. And then you realize, well, wait a minute, this wasn't just a thing of the past. This is happening all the time,
all the
right
time.
now. And then you realize, because I always wondered when I was coming up and, living in a house with, a fairly, a very politically active father and mother. But, how could people be voting against their own self-interests?
Right.
This is why.
And it's just, yeah. And it's not a simple endeavor to determine what their self-interest is, right? That's vastly simplified by the kinds of position, the conversation that you were referring to on your podcast earlier with Dr. Watkins is absolutely an example of that. Right? How can, Black people vote against their self-interest, where self-interest is sort of glibly defined as alliance with the Democratic Party?
Yeah, oh, totally. And, I mean, I've said this to several of my colleagues and friends in the Black community, including Dr. Watkins. And I was like, yeah, it just seems like the Democrats have been pimping Black people for many, many years. And they're like, totally. But, so it's like, if you've given, and the way Dr. Watkins puts it, and, I hope I'm paraphrasing his view accurately, which is, why should we automatically give our vote to one party when they're not really responding to our needs and they're taking us for granted? I mean, it's a basic premise of negotiation. You don't have any leverage if people already know that you're going to be giving them your vote and the power of your community to support their agenda, because it's not just parts of their agenda you're supporting when you vote for a party. You're supporting all of their agenda, which unfortunately historically hasn't really included Black people in a way that they're saying it does. And so that's why he's thinking, well, no, that's not smart. That's not logical. And that doesn't mean he's like this staunch conservative person or whatever, and labels are so ridiculous, which is why we're having this conversation. He's just himself, and he's for Black people. And when I was at the All Black National Conference that he led, which is a whole symposium, convention of 3 days of all about empowering Black people financially, spiritually, and from a health standpoint, and they had a panel to discuss the political landscape. It was fascinating because there were a variety of opinions, but they were actually having honest conversation, which was so refreshing and beautiful in a safe space, which is what we're lacking, which is what your show, which I think is awesome, is promoting.
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly implies that we should be able to listen to anybody, and we can always reserve the right to strongly disagree with what we're hearing. But the only real reason to take on an attitude that we should not, both that we should not listen to certain individuals, but also that we should not look at certain historical events. This is like the idea, you were talking about COVID kind of, I refer to it as clear pilling. I was clear pilled by the pandemic.
A lot of people have been, I think.
In that, like, I could no longer really conceive of the red-blue divide as being realistic, right? But I think, I've lost my train of thought now and where I was going with that. But instead, let me just kind of go back to another issue that really came up when you were talking about that, is that, like with the Panthers, for example, or Malcolm X, right? Historically, it's fascinating to me that when you look at the moment at which they were sort of peak vilified, at which was like, okay, they are really a problem that we have to do something about. It was the moment at which they were beginning to build the most inclusive bridges between disparate, really underserved populations that previously had been at each other's throats. So totally. The Black Panthers with the Rainbow Coalition, that happened largely in our community, when we were little kids, right? Where the Panthers were actually combining with poor white Confederate flag flying racists, you know, essentially, who they managed to actually convince gradually over time that lens was not serving them well, and that they had more in common with the Panthers than they did with the institutions of government that were persecuting both the Panthers and them. And, you know, you can't even imagine that such an allegiance would have, like, imagine Black Lives Matter saying, like, we're going to start working with, like, poor Southern white people who fly the Confederate flag.
Totally.
Because we think that economically we can make an argument that we have some kind of common ground. I mean, it would be political suicide, right?
And blasphemous to a degree.
Absolutely blasphemous. There's a similar sort of shift with Malcolm X, who, you know, very late in his career, he was very separatist, right? Understandably, I could see the arguments for it, but
for sure,
very, very late in his career, began to really embrace the idea that white people and Black people could work together in a powerful, you know, economic struggle. King, for that matter, shortly before his assassination, what really changed was an elevation of his civil rights work to more of kind of a humanist, class-based struggle.
Totally.
Right?
And a lot of people don't want to hear that. They didn't want to hear that, and they didn't want to hear his criticisms of the Vietnam War. They didn't want to hear that. They didn't want to hear how we need to feed poor people and we need to create jobs. And yeah, they were like, whoa. I mean, him and LBJ went round and round. And yeah, I mean, you know, there's this whole argument, was integration really helpful or was it harmful to, you know, and those are real conversations that are being had in the Black community to this day. And that's why when I was at the All Black National Convention with Dr. Watkins, I was like, man, I was privy to a very, very nuanced conversation that was a family affair. They were going at it, and it was fascinating because there's a lot of different perspectives to that conversation that should be had. It's not black and white at all. There's so many shades of gray. And I remember, you know, fairly recently, my son had a wonderful teacher in his high school not too long ago, and they were talking about the difference between Malcolm X and Dr. King, and which would be the best way to go about, you know, helping and empowering Black people for real. And it was a really thoughtful debate, and he didn't cast judgment on the thoughts and you know, ideas that my son had about these two different modes of thought. And then we had some really great conversations. And I used to have these conversations with my father. I mean, it's very, very interesting. And, you know, like my father sat, spoke in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 1949 after serving in World War II and being in D-Day and saying, what are we doing? Are we cozying up to Franco here? And dictators around the world? And he was incensed by how Black people were treated, not just in the army, but in this country. And he's like, what did we go to war for? What are we doing here? So there's always this mixed bag of issues that if we have these blinders on, well, yeah, then we're not going to really get to the heart of the matter ever about anything. Thank you for tuning into the show. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure to subscribe to hear more compelling shows on Rhythm of Life and keep an eye out for our upcoming series of how we as a society oftentimes incentivize all the wrong behavior here in the United States. We see this in the healthcare industry, in the media, and in our educational systems, to name a few of the fields we will be covering. And this is one of the interviews we will be drawing upon for this series. If you have a moment, please leave a rating and review so more people can hear about us, and share about Rhythm of Life on social media, and like us on Facebook. Thanks for listening. I'm Steve Ordower.
This has been a Rhythm and Light production.